What's up everybody? I'm Diana from Starker's Corsetry, and it's been since the beginning of April that I left you at the inserting the busk stage of our corset sew along. How have you guys been since then? What have you been working on? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it. So I'm sorry to leave you hanging, but after I uploaded my mask tutorial, things got bananas. In the best possible way though. I was making masks and scrub caps almost 16 hours a day and loving the challenge. And let's face it, if I'm not busy, I get ridiculous. How, you ask? Well, have you ever needed a project so badly that you learned upholstery and gave your sofa a makeover? Anyhow, most of the mask proceeds went to some amazing new charities that I will have listed below, but a new one that I wanted to tell you about, which any future mask proceeds will be going to, is the Rainbow Railroad. It's a Canadian charity that helps LGBTQIA people find a safe place like Canada if they're facing persecution in the country that they live in. It takes $10,000 to help relocate an individual to safety, and my goal is to raise that much. I love this charity because I love my LGBTQIA friends, family, and clients, and I want everyone to have that opportunity to feel safe and loved and free to love who they choose. So if you have all of your panels prepared, your busk inserted, next we're going to sew the rest of the corset boning channels. Here's what you're going to need. All of your corset panels, bone casing tape. I get this from Farthingale's Corset Supplies. It's basically a tube that you can put your bones into. You're going to need chalk, scissors, your sewing machine, and of course, your tea. So what's on tap today? David's Tea Monster Mash. It's rooibos tea with spices, apples, and these little adorable moons and hats. I've also started a TikTok account, so if you want to join me there, I'm at Starker's Corsetry. So without further ado, let's talk corset making.
Check to make sure you still have all 5 panels of your corset. Take away your center front and center back panels. We're only going to need the center 3, the side front, side, and side back panels. We're going to place our bone casing tape in the center of the wrong side of our panels. So this is going to be on the inside of our corset. We want to make sure that the bone casing tape is exactly center between each waist notch, just so it doesn't get caught in the corset bone cases on either of the seams. So turn your corset panel to the wrong side out and place your corset bone casing on the panel. You may choose to pin it here or just eyeball it. If you're new to it, definitely give it a pin right at the center. Carefully edge stitch the piece of corset boning down onto the wrong side of your fabric. Make sure that your line is perfectly straight and try to line it up with the little groove that's on the side of the corset boning. Check the right side of your panel just to make sure everything looks good there. If you have a really well-trained eye, you may wish to top stitch on the top of your corset panel. Just make sure that it is exactly 3/8 of an inch apart from the initial seam that you made. Double check that everything looks okay on the other side and continue on to the rest of your 5 panels. If you're new to corset making and don't quite trust your eye enough to make a perfect 3/8 inch distance, you can use the other edge of the bone casing as your guide. In my advanced classes, I teach a technique where we pad stitch the bone casing tape to the corset panels. This helps to mold the corset panels to the proper curve. I'll show you how to simulate it here with pins. We bend the corset panel around the edge of our sewing machine and pin the bone casing tape in place to help keep that bend in place as we sew. I prefer to do this with a bias cut piece of coutil as a bone case, but for now we can use our regular bone casing tape for this. Be very careful sewing over your pins and go really slow to make sure that nothing is buckling under itself and that your line is nice and smooth. This should leave us with a slightly enhanced curve on our corset panel. Let's put this all together. Take your panel piece number 2 and your panel piece number 3 and match them together at the waist notch. I prefer using a clip for this rather than a pin. I find that pins can warp the fabric a little bit, but if you prefer pins, absolutely go to it. This is where we have to be very careful about our seam allowances here and to go really slowly around the waist curve just to make sure that you're hitting exactly the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Being even a millimeter off on each panel can mean up to about 1.5 inches extra on your waist circumference. It can go very wrong here very fast if you're not paying close attention, so always double check your measurements. Once your 3 center panel pieces are all sewn together, this is a good opportunity to again double check your measurements to make sure that your waist is exactly what you want it to be. This corset is going to be a 22-inch waist circumference, so if I have done everything right and I've really watched my seam allowances, each half should measure out 11 inches in total. Be sure to check both sides. Also check the ribs and the hips at this point too. Take another look at your seam allowances, make sure they're all exactly even, and don't forget when you're measuring the pin side of your corset panels to go from the center front and not using the underbust overlap. A quick note about seams. We don't want to use an open or French seam here. I know this is a preferred method for some corset makers, and while they do leave a very smooth silhouette, all of the pressure of the corset compression is hinging on the strength of the thread. Even if there's a reinforcement underneath, the thread alone isn't a good idea to support your corset, and it can end up splitting and resulting in a very difficult repair. I use a modified flat felled seam or a top stitched seam. I fold it over to the side and top stitch through several layers to provide maximum strength and durability in the seams. We're going to line up our bone casing tape with our seam stitch. We may want to lighten it with some chalk just so we can see a little easier if we're using a darker fabric. Stitch as close as you can to the original seam allowance stitch, making sure that the bone casing tape lines up perfectly with the stitch line. Be very careful around the waist curve. Depending on the severity of the curve, you may need to take this one little stitch at a time. Just make sure that your bone casing tape doesn't fold over onto itself. Repeat this on all of your other seam allowances, making sure that they're all on the same side. So for instance, they're all facing the forward panel or they're all facing the back panel. You don't necessarily want to alternate front and back. And you guys, I'm not even going to begin to apologize for the state of my nails. They are not awesome. I attempted acrylic nails on my own without my amazing, amazing nail lady. And, you know, we're still social distancing. It is what it is. Now we're going to fold all of the seam allowances under so that the bone casing tape is covering all of the seam allowances. Before we grade away any of the seam allowances or trim out any of the bulk, we're going to top stitch or edge stitch the top of the corset just to make sure that the bone case tape lies flat. Be very careful while stitching around the curvy parts of the corset. It's easy to sew a little bit more than the seam allowance, a little more than you intended, so very carefully pull the panels apart as you're sewing. Once your top stitch, edge stitch is finished, flip the corset over to the wrong side and look at your seam allowances. Very, very carefully grade out some of the extra bulk on only one of the pieces of the seam allowances. The top stitch was able to catch the first layer of it. We just want to take out a little bit of the extra bulk. Be very careful you don't cut it too short. I would say just the top 3 millimeters would be great. The other side of the seam allowance should probably remain as it is, as long as it doesn't overlap the corset bone casing. Now with a properly graded seam, we can turn our corset over to the right side and top stitch exactly 3/8 of an inch away from our last edge stitch. When we get to the waist curve, fold your corset panel around to represent what the original pattern piece looked like. This will prevent any buckling or any folding of your fabric panel. So very, very carefully around the waist curve and around the hip curve. Continue to grade down your seam allowances and top stitch your bone casing tape down. Now that your center panels are all properly sewn, we're going to grab our 2 center front busk panels and attach those to the 3 panels that we've now finished. We're going to sew the center front panel the same way we did with all of the other panels. A 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down on both the left and the right. And then we're going to go ahead and attach the bone case tape exactly the same way we did with all of the other seam allowances. Grade down the seam allowance and top stitch exactly the same way you did with all of your other panels. Set aside your center panels, and now we're going to be using only our center back and placket panels. Place your placket and center back panels right sides together at the center back seam allowance. Stitch a 3/8 seam allowance all the way down. Fold your placket over so that it covers the seam allowance, and now your right sides of the fabric should be showing. We want to start top stitching and edge stitching the placket side only, just to catch the seam allowances underneath. It's easiest to go ahead and do these both at the same time. Once your edge stitch is complete, take your placket and fold it underneath your center back panel. If you have a really crisp coutil, it's easy to do this just with your fingers, but you may want to press this just to give it a crisp edge. Fold your placket underneath the center back panel and edge stitch this all the way down on both pieces. Next, place the edge of your fabric right at the 1/2 inch mark of your plate. Stitch all the way down with a 1/2 inch. To create our grommet channel, we're going to line up the edge of our fabric with the 1 inch mark on our plate and stitch that all the way down. Now we're going to create the final bone casing for our lacing placket. Fold under your seam allowance so that 3/8 of an inch is available for you to put your boning through. If you have a nice solid coutil, it's easy to do this with your fingers, but you might need to use some pins and an iron. Double check that your bone case that you've just created is exactly 3/8 of an inch wide. Edge stitch all the way down on both panels. And there you have it, you've just created your lacing channels. Finally, we attach our center back panel to the rest of our corset exactly the same way we did with our center front panels. 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down. Attach the bone casing tape exactly the same way we did with all of the other panels as well. Grade down the bulk of your seam allowance as we did in all the other corset panels. Edge stitch and top stitch. And there you have it, our bone cases are all finished and the inside of our corset now looks nice and pretty with no raw edges out. Our corset's now ready for the upper binding and the bones to go in. So watch our video next time and I'll show you how to do that. Thanks for watching.
I have to wait for my guinea pig to stop drinking.